Ah, welcome back to the laboratory, dear friends. Tonight, a small story about a very small error and the extraordinary art of making it worse. It is the autumn of 1994. In Lynchburg, Virginia, a mathematics professor is counting prime numbers. It is patient, unglamorous work, the sort that runs for months on a room full of humming machines, and for 4 of those months, one of his answers has been quietly, stubbornly wrong. He has checked his equations. He has rewritten his program. He has, in fact, found a genuine flaw in his compiler, and it turns out to be entirely innocent. And on a Saturday in October, having eliminated every other possibility in the world, the professor arrives at a conclusion so absurd he can hardly credit it. The fault is not in his mathematics. The fault is in the chip. I am the magnanimous Dr. Warthen, and this is the Broken Machine Society. Case file number 8, The Chip That Could Not Divide. If you enjoy watching a large company argue with arithmetic, do tap that like button. It costs you nothing, which is, coincidentally, what the society charges. Now, let us admire the patient. In 1994, the Intel Pentium was the finest thinking machine money could buy, and the crown jewel of the most successful semiconductor company on Earth. You have heard its jingle. You have seen the sticker on the case. Intel had spent a fortune teaching ordinary people to care what was inside their computer, a magnificent piece of persuasion, and one that would shortly become the most expensive decision the company ever made. Because if you convince the whole world to trust the little chip in the box, dear friends, then the whole world is watching when the little chip is wrong. And this one was wrong. Rarely, quietly, but wrong. Here is how. Division, as you may recall from school, is tedious. You guess a digit, you multiply, you subtract, you bring down the next one, and you do it again and again. A chip that divides that way is a slow chip. So the engineers gave the Pentium a shortcut, a table, a great grid of pre-computed answers, so that instead of laboriously working out each next digit, the machine could simply glance at the table and read it off. Fast, elegant, and perfectly sound, provided that the table is complete. It was not. Of the thousands of entries in that grid, a handful had been left out. 5 of them mattered. And when the division landed on one of those 5 missing squares, the chip did not halt. It did not complain. It did not throw up a single red light. It simply read the blank as a 0, which is a perfectly legal answer, an answer the machine had every right to give, and carried on confidently into a wrong result. That, dear friends, is the whole disease in a sentence. It was not that the machine gave an impossible answer, it gave a possible one. Speaking of impressive machinery producing very little, I am told it is time for a brief word from tonight's sponsor. I have no sponsor. It calculates my odds. Hourly. Now, where were we? Ah, yes. The professor's name was Thomas Nicely, and I want you to appreciate his position. He had a result that disagreed with the world, and the world was a very large thing to disagree with. So he did what a careful man does. He assumed it was his own fault and spent 4 months proving otherwise. He ran the numbers on an older machine, and they came out right. He ran them in a different programming language, and the error followed him. He telephoned a colleague who found the same thing on a new computer. And then, in a moment I find perfectly delightful, he walked into an office supply store and tried the sum on a display model sitting on the shelf. A machine that had never met him, never met his software, and was simply standing there in a shop, doing arithmetic wrong for anyone who cared to look. On the 24th of October, he telephoned the manufacturer and was logged, politely, as a support call. 6 days later, having heard nothing useful, he sent an email to about a dozen people he thought might help. And I must stress the tone of it, because history has flattened it. It was not an accusation. It was a request for assistance. Could you kind people test some other machines and tell me what you find? They could. And here, dear friends, is the moment the 20th century changed. In an earlier decade, that email would have died in a drawer. But it was 1994, and the world had just been wired together. The message went to a bulletin board, then to a news group, and by the 3rd of November, the discussion had a title, and the title said, Glaring Bug. An engineer in California reverse-engineered the divider from the outside, purely by observing which sums it got wrong, and produced the worst case anyone would find, a division whose answer went astray in the 4th digit. By the 7th, it was on the front page of the trade press. By late November, it was on the evening news, where an anchor did the sum on air. The professor, who had wanted only to count prime numbers, was being telephoned by the New York Times. Now, Intel had a problem, and here is where a modest engineering defect becomes a case file, because the company already knew. Its own testers had found the flaw months earlier, quietly corrected it in newer production, and told nobody. And when the world came asking, the company reached not for an apology, but for a calculator. It published a statistical study, and the study said, this will affect an ordinary spreadsheet user once every 27,000 years. Dear friends, I have been in the business of broken machines for some time, and I tell you there is no sentence in the English language more inflammatory than a corporation explaining to you, with arithmetic, that you are not entitled to be annoyed. The customers did not want a probability. They wanted a chip that could divide. And the company's remedy made it worse. You could have a replacement, yes, if you first satisfied Intel that your work was important enough to need one. Prove your mathematics matters, and we shall consider it. The Internet, which was young and had just discovered what it was for, responded with joy. The jokes arrived in their thousands. What do you get when you cross a mathematician with a Pentium? A mathematician who cannot divide. The chairman himself went on to the news groups to explain the company's position, and was flamed by strangers for his trouble. And on the 12th of December, the largest computer maker on Earth stopped shipping Pentium machines altogether, and the argument was effectively over. 8 days later, Intel surrendered. A full-page advertisement, an apology, and a free replacement for anyone who asked. No questions, no proof, no interrogation. The company took a charge of $475 million against its earnings. And now, dear friends, the twist that the legend always leaves out. Intel did not suffer. That very quarter, in the depths of the humiliation, was the best quarter the company had ever had. Sales were up by a third, shipments hit a record. The following year was better still. Most customers never asked for a replacement at all, and much of that great pile of set-aside money was never spent. The returned chips were ground up to recover their gold, and the company made keychains out of the flawed ones and gave them to the staff, engraved with a line from the chairman. Bad companies are destroyed by crises. Good companies survive them. Great companies are improved by them. He was right, as it happens. The company that emerged began publishing its known defects openly, where anyone could read them, and poured its money into proving its arithmetic correct by mathematics rather than by hoping. The generation of chips in your pocket tonight is descended directly from that embarrassment. And here is tonight's lesson, so listen closely. The flaw in the machine was genuinely tiny. The flaw in the response was enormous, and it was this. The company decided how much its customers were permitted to care. It ran the numbers on other people's feelings and announced the result. And you may be a fine engineer, dear friends, with a fine statistical study, and be entirely correct about the probability, and still be catastrophically wrong, because trust is not a quantity you get to compute on someone else's behalf. The chairman himself said it best afterward. We presume to tell people what they should and should not worry about. And so, the society closes the folder on the chip that could not quite divide. Case closed. Next time, before the society, a Wall Street trading firm, one summer morning in 2012, that lost $440 million in 45 minutes. Because when they installed the new software on 8 computers, one of them did not get the message. And on that one lonely machine, something very old woke up. Stay curious, check your tables, and never tell a man how much to worry. The society is adjourned.